Please welcome the president and founder of the Energy Foundation, Eric Heitz.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. After that last panel, I might need to go get a drink of water, since there's not going to be much left. Stay tuned. This is a really good panel. Last but not least, thank you, of course, to Senator Reid for putting this together. I've attended many of these summits, and this one has just been fantastic. It's my job to introduce the 21st Century Energy Markets panel. And I want to make just a couple short points and then throw out a challenging question for the panelists. The first point I want to make is that, and you've heard it today, that change is here. Utility markets are changing and more change is coming. The question is how fast and how much change. Now, a few facts you've heard, some of you have heard today about this change. Gas generation is on the rise. It's going to quickly take over in terms of coal. This will be historic in the U.S. Cost of solar is down 80% in the last 5 years. Half of the new generation, you heard this from Secretary Jewell, half of the new generation in the U.S. last year was renewable, mostly wind. Another fact, Walmart is now the largest commercial procurer of photovoltaics. Now, of course, we hope that Mandalay takes over, and hearing from Lisa Jackson, we hope that Apple takes over on that as well. And then last week, Goldman Sachs put out a report, some of you may have seen it, global market for renewable energy estimated at $200 billion. So change is here, and three forces are going to continue to push this change. First, you've heard it today, technological innovation on the supply side, the demand side, on the grid. Second is customer desire. Now this one hasn't gotten as much emphasis today, it's gotten some. We do a lot of polling and message work in my organization, and I can tell you across every demographic and across both party lines, people want clean energy, and they want clean energy choices. And that is very, very clear in all the data. Third forcing function that's going to keep this change going is carbon regulations. So the second point I want to make is that one size does not fit all when you think of what is the market structure that accomplishes the clean energy goals, that deals with carbon, the challenge of carbon and global warming. There is no single market model that will work across the utility industry. We heard some of the things customers want. We know they want clean, reliable, affordable energy. We know utilities and investors, we heard from some of them today, they want stability. And we know new market entrants, they want access to information, and they want access to markets that are stable and have a clear signal so they can raise money. We count, and we track this stuff all over the US, we count right now 24 different conversations going on new utility business models. EEI, from EEI to Amory Lovins at RMI, and everything in between. There's dozens and dozens of discussions going on, or 24 discussions going on this utility business model. I want to announce a resource that the Energy Foundation is working on, which we hope the people in this room and the decision makers at the state level, the regional level, the national level who are working on this might find valuable. It's called America's Power Plan, and it's a synthesis of the discussions and dialogues going on in these different utility business model discussions. And we tapped 100 experts, and we're releasing 6 papers at NASIO, the state energy officials meeting in Denver in next month. This is called America's Power Plan. You can get it at americaspowerplan.com. It's got new utility models, synthesis of what's out there, wholesale market design, distributed generation, transmission policy, siting, finance, and a summary paper. Many of the people in this room and some of the panelists you saw earlier today have participated in this. So let me close then with a challenging scenario for our panelists. We've got a great panel coming up. Here's the scenario. Let's assume that California increases its RPS to 51% in 2015 from 33% today. And in addition, other Western states increase their RPSs. California turns to the neighboring states for help to build this multi-billion-dollar industry. Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, all the western states have something to offer: wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. But everyone hits a brick wall because the Western energy market is broken. It's divided into a set of public and private fiefdoms that rarely work together. Here's my question for the panel. How do we fix this broken regional market structure and bring the enormous economic and environmental benefits of clean energy to the West? Thank you very much, and now I turn it over to the Comptroller of Nevada to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Presumably none of you have a 5 o'clock flight. My name's Kate Marshall. I'm your state treasurer. You might wonder, why is the state treasurer here moderating a panel on energy? The state of Nevada has a private equity fund called the Silver State Opportunity Fund. And when you look at investing in private equity in the state of Nevada, you quickly come to a conversation about energy. How are we distributing energy? How are we generating energy? And what are we doing to integrate renewable energy? And so that brings us here to this panel today, 21st Century Energy. We have a lot of distinguished guests here, and I'm going to ask them first to introduce themselves. We'll start from the gentleman on the far and talk a little bit about who they are and why they're sitting here today to talk to you about the future of energy right here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kate. Greg Abel, Chief Executive Officer, Chairman of Mid-American Energy Holdings Company. Obviously been invited to the conference because we're in a transaction with NV Energy and Michael's team. So it's great to be here in the state. We operate a multinational company with energy assets around the globe. But we have a pretty unique feature. We started as a very small renewable energy company. We had 8 geothermal projects in California. Those projects are still operating today with a good resource that supports them. From that, we grew a company that continued to invest in assets, but really on the regulated side. And we saw a unique opportunity there, and that was really, how do we transform that model, focusing on introducing renewables into those businesses. And we've continued that in Iowa, in our utility there in the Midwest, Mid-American Energy Company, and then also with Pacific Corp. And I would say that then continued to evolve as we looked at Pacific Corp. How do we tackle some of the transmission issues? How do we look at the energy imbalance markets? And our team in Pacific Corp's done a great job of focusing in that area. And then lastly, I would touch on that we've continued to build our what I would quote or call our unregulated, regulated business. We have 2 of the largest solar projects being built in California. Basically committed $7 billion to 3 different solar projects in the last 24 months. So we haven't lost that focus on the renewable energy side. And that's really the exciting thing, that when Michael and I got together the first time to talk about how do we take these immense resources that exist in this state and utilize them on behalf of NV Energy's customers and ultimately on behalf of the state.
Hi, I'm Arno Harris. I'm CEO of Recurrent Energy. We're one of North America's leading developers of utility-scale solar projects. We've got about 800 megawatts under contract now with utilities. We'll have about 500 megawatts built by the end of this year. We've raised about $3 billion of project finance to build those projects. So we're part of this change that we're talking about at this conference today. I'm also the board chair of the Solar Energy Industry Association, so I get to represent 1,000 members involved in the solar industry who are all focused on ensuring that solar power becomes an important part of the sources of electricity that are powering this country. I would say for context and thinking about why I'm on this panel really comes down to recognizing that we're at a really remarkable point in the development of renewables in the U.S. We're at this place that I like to call, it's really the transition to the era of mainstream renewables. And that's in part driven by the major cost reductions we've heard many panelists talk about today, the 80% reduction in solar, reductions in the cost of wind, that have effectively made wind and solar now some of the most competitive sources of energy out there. and have brought solar and wind to the point now where, along with natural gas, those are the top 3 sources of new build technology that are going to power our country's future. So very, very exciting time, and a very exciting time for the industry in terms of how far we've come. What's interesting, I think, is in this transition is to recognize that as we move from a period where, or into a period where cost is no longer the primary objection to renewables, the barrier really starts to become the physical limits and the operating limits in the grid itself in terms of how much variable generation the grid can bear. And so I think that one of the most important things we need to address, touching on Eric's opening comments, is really what are the changes that we need to make to the way that the grid operates and we put the grid together and all the different pieces that make up the entire electricity system. What is that future electricity system that enables us to make the most of this bounty of affordable, competitive wind and solar that we now have available to us as a nation? The answer, I think, is contained in this big idea called flexible grid. And flexible grid is a really compelling vision. It's a vision of an electricity system that can move energy around regions, so it can move it from where it's being generated to where it is needed. It's a system that can encourage markets for flexible generation products, so electricity products that can ramp up and down and provide regulation services to, again, incorporate all that variable generation, that variable clean generation. It's a system that also, at the demand end of the network, features resources that allow operators to have visibility into and to control load in much the way that they control generation today. And it's a system in which communication affords scheduling and forecasting of resources at a much finer sort of grain level and allows a greater degree of control and allows us to maintain that balance between largely variable generation and load. The tools we have today, the grid we have today, many experts estimate couldn't get to maybe 30 or 40% renewables, but we really need to go so much further than that if we're going to tap that bounty of affordable wind and solar. And so the challenge we face is really this kind of complex Rubik's Cube of market issues and technology issues, regulatory issues, and political issues. And it has the potential to be a very, very challenging problem for us to solve because of all the interests involved in seeing it stay the way it is. And so my worry is that it's going to take us too long to put that system in place, and we just don't have the time. We're in a place where already, as California's RPS is reaching fulfillment, as the PTC is in limbo, pipelines are drying up, and we're at risk of losing the momentum that's been built in these industries. And unless we find a way to make incremental steps forward, meaningful steps forward, to establish and build this flexible grid, we're going to be facing a tremendous challenge.
Hi, I'm Doug Larson. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Interstate Energy Board. It's an association of 11 Western states and 3 Western Canadian provinces, essentially the entire geography of the Western interconnection. And the challenge Eric outlined is exactly the one the states and provinces see. So I want to make 4 points. One is we're entering a post-RPS environment in which cost is going to be the driver for the deployment of new renewables. Good news is, as Arno pointed out, is the price is coming down for wind and solar, substantially for solar, and the price of alternatives, gas, nuclear, coal, is generally going up. That's the good news. The bad news in the West is that we haven't found yet the cheap way to integrate this variable generation. There are things individual utilities can do, such as improved wind and solar forecasting, or better using demand response to integrate variable generation. But the big mother lode for the West is increased cooperation among utilities, and we haven't seen that yet. This is cooperation in the sense of an interconnection-wide energy imbalance market, changing the way we use reserves and reserve sharing groups. We need progress on this because right now we're on a course to sort of a high cost method of integrating the amount of wind and solar that we've got in the pipeline, much less the amount that Eric postulated. We generally lag in the West, the other regions of the country, in terms of inter-utility cooperation, and that's our big challenge. Finally, I think there's another sleeper or wild card in this equation, which is a drop in PV prices. And it was referenced in earlier panels as to whether that will ultimately undercut the traditional utility regulatory model wherein utilities get rewarded for capital investment in central station power plants and transmission lines. And it's not clear where we reach that crossover point. But I think we're already seeing some behavior and some investments which are probably not productive from the public interest point of view or from the interest of ratepayers. We're probably overbuilding gas-fired generation because every utility is on its own. It's sort of the Western cowboy attitude. We've got to integrate this variable generation on our own rather than cooperating with our neighbors. The net effect is likely to be an overbuild of gas-fired generation and some stranded investment in the case of merchant investment.
I'm Michael Yakira, the CEO of NV Energy, and to summarize what Arno said, I think he's saying the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind and solar. Oh, Michael. Sorry. NV Energy is the investor-owned utility, at least for some period of time, in this state. We cover about 93% of our state electrically. We have a very aggressive portfolio standard here, not quite as aggressive as California's. We have to reach 25% by 2025, and we are ahead of the curve in terms of meeting the schedule that's required by statute. We're very proud of what we've done, both in terms of renewable energy and transmission development, as well as building a fleet of very clean, highly efficient, low water use generating plants that use natural gas to produce electricity in Nevada for our state and for our customers. Our prices have been stable for 10 years, and I think that's very good news for our customers. I look forward to continuing to work with Greg as we are developing a plan to assure that the renewable resources in this state, which are vast and probably greater than this state can absorb itself because it's rather small in terms of population, utilize those resources to benefit our customers by perhaps selling out of state, but also to utilize the strength of Mid-American under the umbrella of Berkshire Hathaway to improve the cost position, again, for the benefit of the customers. So this marriage is one that I'm looking forward to consummating, and look forward to continuing dialogue with our regulators and with our customers and how we're going to improve the renewable position in the state.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Arvizu. I'm the director at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm proud to say that our laboratory has been in this business for more than 35 years. And we've seen a lot of progress. And I think one of the things that we applaud is this notion that there are options that we can actually take advantage of. And I won't repeat what some of my colleagues have already indicated in terms of the state of play. But let's just say that public policy works. We've seen the inclusion and a growing renewable energy and energy efficiency technology industry. And where I stop to applaud the progress that we've made at the same time, there are still many challenges. If you look at how much generation we have in this country, from non-hydro renewables, it's less than 5%. Solar, which I think is going to be in a renaissance period for the next few decades, is 1%. And one of the things that we always try to understand is what's the potential, where can it go? So at the laboratory, in addition to doing great science and doing technology development, one of the things that we're focused on these days is the integration and the scale-up of renewable energy into the grid and into the system. So I very much agree with what's been said relative to the next big challenge. If we're going to put renewable energy on the grid at scale, then there are a number of challenges that we need to both address and ultimately look at from a very, I think, top-down, sophisticated roadmap sort of way. So in the context of that, we've been doing a number of analysis. So many of you are familiar with our recent renewable energy, renewable electricity future study, which opined on how much is available, do we have enough resource, and can it serve the load, at least on an hourly basis? And the results of that study, engaged by many, many stakeholders and many participants, suggest that really we don't really have a limitation on how much we can aspire to, but there are challenges in how you might go about doing that. And it does relate to public policy, it relates to transmission, it relates to cooperation, and it relates to science and additional development on technologies. We've done a Western wind and solar interconnect study, phase 1, phase 2, and now we're in phase 3. which are looking at, again, very, very sophisticated analysis that will allow us to better understand what are the challenges that will happen. And one thing that I would add to maybe the conversation that's gone on most of the day is that when we get to a high penetration renewable scenario, lots of things are different. And you really do have to think through what's your public policy, what's your endpoint vision. And so where I think we can say with confidence, we know that there's a high penetration renewables future out there should we choose to pursue it. We do need to be deliberate about how we go about it. Because flexibility of the grid is certainly one of the big issues. Cooperation is another big issue. But all the smart grid technologies that are necessary are just now under development. And I think a lot still needs to happen. And so where I will applaud where we are and where we need to go, I think there's still a lot to be done. And it will take, I think, in order that we optimize the resources, an ability for us to work together. The last thing I'll say really has to do with, can you get there at a cost that's lower than the cost of the current system and its trajectory? And the answer to that, I think, is still TBD, but we have scenarios that are based on some analytical underpinnings that would suggest that it is possible. Now, we'll stop short of saying we can achieve it, only because we have to decide that we want to get there first, and then I think we've got the opportunity to get there. So I look forward to the additional conversation.
Hi, I'm Ben Folk, and I'm the Chairman and CEO of Xcel Energy. We operate in 8 states, from the North Star in Minnesota down to the Lone Star in Texas and in Colorado. We're pretty proud of what we've been able to accomplish on the environmental front. We are the #1 wind provider in the nation with 5,000 megawatts online, and we have plans to add 2,000 megawatts to our portfolio within the next 12 months. We're also the 5th largest solar provider, and we've been a leader in conservation. And so when you add those initiatives combined with the decisions we made, proactive decisions we made on our fossil fleet, it's allowed us to reduce our carbon footprint by 18%, carbon emissions by 18% since 2005, and we're on track to almost do 30% by 2020. So while we're proud of that, we're just as proud of the fact that our rates are at or below the national median. So you can accomplish those goals. They don't have to be exclusive if you do it in a pragmatic approach. And to Dan's point, policy is extremely important. And so when we look at the energy imbalance markets, which we're very supportive of, we have seen the benefits, having been in 2 RTOs, of how much integration costs can be reduced, how much generation efficiency can be reduced through the energy imbalance markets. But I also know, from a pragmatic standpoint, it's not easy. And we're going to have to, I was trying to think of a song, Michael, that, come on, let's work together or something like that. But I'll leave the song quotes out. But we do need to work together to achieve that. And I think, again, to Dan's point, public policy is so important, because as you have increased penetration rates with renewables, be it wind or solar, there are integration costs that will increase. And they're all the more increased when you have 37 balancing areas in the West, which I believe we do. So an imbalance market's going to help, as is public policy support. We've been big advocates, in addition to things like ITC and PTC, something called a CRC, which is a Consumer Renewable Integration Credit, which helps those utilities that are actually bringing all these renewables together offset some of those integration costs. So you put all that together, and I think we can get there. So maybe it's here comes the sun.
Well, one thing I noticed is that as soon as everyone introduced themselves, the room started to fill up. So I gather people are interested. So let me pull it back up a little bit, though, maybe to the 10,000-foot level. Are we in danger of renewable energy development stalling? And what, so along those lines, talk to me about what drives renewable energy projects today and what holds them back?
I'll jump in there. Yes, I mean, I think we're absolutely at risk of renewable energy development in North America stalling. We've had a tremendous boom both in wind and in solar, driven in fact by favorable federal policy, the PTC and the ITC, as well as favorable state level policy in the form of RPS. And the challenges we're facing is that a lot of these policies are either expired or reaching sort of their conclusion, or going to expire in the not so distant future. What that creates is a environment, and this is something I think regulators constantly have to weigh, which is it creates an environment of uncertainty that is not business friendly, is not investment friendly. And so what we saw in the wind industry in this last year installed something like 12 gigawatts of wind. This year in the first half has only installed, I think, 1 gigawatt or less. So just dramatic shift. And of course, the event that happened in the middle of that was the PTC expiring at the end of last year and being renewed at the last minute for one more year, but with not enough lead time to get developers out of the blocks. So those developers last year, when they saw that expiring, mothballed pipelines and then didn't have anything to build in the first half of this year. And we're at risk of a trend like that across the board, with the ITC potentially expiring at the end of 2016. We're getting into a range where developers may start to be cautious about making additional investment. And of course, with the challenges around really putting the pieces of a flexible grid in place, still unresolved and really uncertain, we don't have the sort of environment that developers are going to feel really competent about putting money in the ground and pursuing development of those resources.
You know, I would just add that as most utilities, and Xcel is no exception, we're in the middle of a huge infrastructure refresh. And what that means is that we're asking for rate relief to help support investments in transmission and distribution. And so I think it's really important that we pursue the right cost points when it comes to renewables, because if we're not careful and we pursue renewables or we have public policies in place that are expensive, we're going to make it very easy for critics of clean energy to say that's why it's so expensive, because you were pushing renewables. And the reality is that the reason why I'm bringing wind energy on, and yes, it's supported by PTC, but it's cheaper than I can buy a 20-year gas strip right now. So I'm looking at wind as just a fuel hedge. And that's a great thing for my customers, because I can add that wind and save them money. I can't make that statement about everything. And so I think as an industry and working with the clean energy groups, we need to make sure that we're fair to all customers and we have balanced public policy, because when those rates rise, you know, nobody wins. And that's what we all have to be focused on.
Kate, since you started with this being at the 10,000-foot level, if I can take it to 50,000 foot for just a second. You know, a couple of months ago, I was at a conference. It wasn't a conference, by invitation only, workshop in the UK, essentially, with a bunch of European leaders. In fact, leaders from all over the globe. And this very question came up. So, are we at risk with natural gas prices coming down the way they are of renewable energy stalling? And it was interesting that as we went around the table, 20-something countries spoke up. A few said yes, we're at risk. Many said no, we're not. And it has to do whether your economy is growing or whether you are adding new energy infrastructure and new energy investments or not. And in the emerging economies, Asia, Indonesia, South America, even Africa, what you'll find is we're not in danger of renewables being left behind. In the more developed world, OECD countries typically, there is much more of a challenge. And domestically, it's even a greater challenge, because even though I think we're making strides and we've got a lot of progress, our energy prices are sufficiently low that the hurdle rate for renewable energy is much higher in this country than it is elsewhere. So the short answer is, as a globe, as an industry globally, we've got great potential for renewable energy. As an opportunity for the U.S. to use it as a mechanism by which we can develop leadership in our technology areas, I think we are at great risk.
Moving down the geographic scale to the west, I think one other challenge we've had is we're not growing at the rate we used to be growing. So there's not a lot of headroom for new generation of any type. Now, the one counter to that is we are seeing more retirements of coal plants and an involuntary nuclear plant in California, and maybe some once-through cooling gas plants in California. That's creating some headroom, but not at the scale that we did when we were growing at a much faster rate than our little 1.4% in the West right now.
Well, okay, so let me parse that out a little bit. I mean, you started out talking about federal regulations and kind of the impact, right? So the president's come out with a climate plan, put some renewable energy goals in there. What would you do? Mid-American? Go on.
Sure, I'd be happy to touch on, because we have a pretty unique model. We actually haven't had to have targets or RPSs in place to pursue building out renewables. The reality is, if you look at our model in the Midwest, we've invested more than $6 billion. We have 3,300 megawatts of wind in development or in construction. We're operating in Iowa, and it's been done with a 1% RPS. And we'll soon have 40% of our capacity coming from wind. Oftentimes, 100% of our energy comes from renewable energy. And it's really been driven by what Ben highlighted, is it the right economic decision for customers? And we've been able to identify ways to do it through, the production tax credits that exist at the federal government. We have a very efficient capital structure because we're part of Berkshire, and we can utilize our full tax appetite. So I think there are still very significant opportunities when I look across the U.S. to continue to build out renewables, and not looking for really specific state policy on encouraging it. I think it will. If we see the PTC, ITC expiring, obviously we'll all be looking at what the RPSs are in the surrounding states, and I think it will encourage, obviously, continued building. But I think we constantly have to go back to trying to make sure we've got an industry that's delivering value and a real sustainable solution to our customers.
Well, Michael, you know where I'm going with this, right? So we just had Mid-American say that they're investing in wind in Iowa, and it's kind of windy here, it's kind of sunny here, we kind of have geothermal here. What do you think about investing in renewable energy projects yourself? What do you think about NV Energy doing
Well,
that?
we have invested in a small way in renewable energy. In fact, well before we even thought about this combination, we have a very small waste heat recovery system off a compressor station of the Kern River pipeline. Kern River is one of the subsidiaries of Mid-American, where we capture the waste heat that would have gone into the air and make it into electricity using the equivalent of geothermal equipment. I think with the combination with Mid-American, there's going to be more opportunity for NV Energy to invest, because we believe it's going to be a lower cost for the customer at the end of the day. And that's really what it's all about. Providing options to our customers. Where I want to see us go as a company, as an industry, is providing all the options to customers that they want to deal with us as a producer of electricity. If they don't want to think about how they get energy, it's not a big deal to them, sell a flat rate. If it makes sense for them to be on a time of use rate, offer that to them. If they want a green power tariff where they're not investing in a green project, but they want to be green and they're willing to pay more for that, that's fine. If they want to see solar on rooftop and they want to make the investment in that, we should provide the opportunity for them to do that. If they don't want to invest and have us invest in their place, we should do that. It's similar to the way the telephone industry evolved over time. It went from landline protective to fiber optic to cell phone technology that ultimately said, we're going to deal with the customer the way the customer wants to be dealt with. And that's the transition I really see happening, both in Nevada as well as throughout the United States.
Well, can I stick in a plug here for Nevada? Do you see these investments being homegrown Nevada investments? Do you see that as an option?
Oh, without a doubt. I think we have more resources in this state, as I said in the opening, than we can possibly use for the state with 2.5 million people in this state. You know, we have, by some counts, tens of thousands of megawatts of solar, maybe as much as 2,500 megawatts of additional geothermal capacity. There isn't as much wind as you would think in areas where it can be captured.
Only at my house.
Maybe in your house. Well, we should talk about our renewable generations program, and maybe we should give you some rebates to put up a small wind turbine. But I think that there is opportunity for us not only to invest, but also to make it an export commodity that can benefit the state, building property tax base, creating jobs, but also, and I love hearing Greg talk about this because philosophically we're in the same place. If you build something and you sell it to another state, you bring the proceeds back into the state to lower the price for the customer. I think we have the opportunity to do that for the surrounding states. The question is, do we have the the public will to work in a region rather than state by state, rather than creating silos.
Well, okay, so we've heard a little bit about balancing authorities, and I think you mentioned 37, right? And we heard a little bit about this needs to be a more regional approach. Okay, so let's talk about states and balancing authorities becoming more integrated, and what you think that'll do to the price of electricity, and what you think that will do to customers, and what do you think a grid begins to look like?
Let me take a stab at that. In the case, I think it's most important to integrate the balancing authorities, the industry balancing authorities, as opposed to state policies. This is the low-hanging fruit. There have been a number of studies. One way to do that is through an energy imbalance market where certain functions of these 37 groups are performed on a regional basis as opposed to 37 different times. There's been several analyses, including one that's underway at NV Energy and one that you and the California ISO have done. West-wide, there's analyses. We're looking at a low end, maybe $70 million in benefits a year, to a sort of medium end of $300 million, to a more extreme end, depending on your assumptions, up to $1.3 billion. So there's real money on the table from these efficiencies, just from energy cost savings. But as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has said in a paper they developed, there are reliability benefits if we are to operate an energy imbalance market. And we should not forget those reliability benefits because right now coordinating operations among 37 different entities in real time is really hard, and we've in fact screwed up in the past. We screwed up in San Diego in September 11, 2008. So we've got a pretty fractured system that's costing us money and costing us reliability.
And I'll just add to that, I think that's absolutely accurate. The studies that we've done at NREL as well suggest that there's a lot of money to be had just on the energy savings piece if you optimize at the systems level. No question about that. The challenge, of course, is how do you get the cooperation to occur? And I think one of the things that we've begun to only recently understand better is when you get to really high renewable energy penetrations, let's go to Eric's scenario about California going to a 50%. What that's going to create is an opportunity, maybe even a challenge for California, in that they cannot necessarily balance within their own system. Now they need some cooperation. They need firming from other states. They need ancillary services of all kinds. They need to be able to increase the geographic diversity of the resources because they've got loads, but the peak profile doesn't match those the resources that they have available. But they may match what goes on in Wyoming and other parts of Nevada and other places in the West. All of those things offer the ingredients for major framing and cooperation, but you do need to have a framework that everybody signs into, and that perhaps is the biggest challenge that we have. The opportunity space is great. The challenge is also great because what you end up having to do is you have to cooperate self-interests, where if you're going to make an investment in a particular country, a state where you have an RPS, that burden has been assigned to those ratepayers. If you want those benefits then to go elsewhere somehow, you better get some quid pro quo out of that, or that's not really going to sell very well in the legislatures. So there's a lot to be done there.
That's the key. You know, when you talk about upwards of $1 billion of savings, that might be the case. How do you divvy it up? As long as everybody is a winner, that's fine. If there are winners and losers, that's an issue. But even if everyone is a winner, how do you figure that? To me, the figuring out the divvying up of those winners will be an interesting exercise. Not that it can't be done.
And that describes the paralysis of the West. For some reason, other regions in the Midwest have crossed this threshold. We haven't yet, and we need to.
Well, and I think that's I mean, if there are two possible paths to go down that way, and there's the paralysis path, which is trying to figure out how to launch, consolidate the entire thing in one big go, and do sort of a top-down consolidation of that authority. And I think that's probably got slim to none sort of chance against it. I think what MidAmerican and the ISO are doing with the EIM is just exactly the right approach, which it's incremental, so it's starting just with 2 areas, and it's voluntary. So basically it's a market in which they participate if they want to, and I think the idea in that's really smart is rather than having to do a study and prove it to somebody and then hope that they change regulation on the basis of that study, is they're just going to put it in practice, and I think they're going to start to see the benefits of that, and then other people are going to start to see the benefit of that. And then if we bring in somebody else into that market, you get several major players working. I think you start to see kind of a domino effect where the benefits that are conferred to those regions and to the ratepayers in those regions are going to start to be a pretty compelling argument for other balancing authorities joining. And with a little luck, we get a more consolidated area.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with sort of the strategy behind it, which is to create a prototype and something we can see how it's functioning and really demonstrate to the folks in the West that there is value in this type of situation. So when we looked at it, we obviously have seen one work in the Midwest where we have a very, very extensive set of utilities and other partners that operate across multiple states. But that took many years to get to that point. That didn't happen overnight, and you had to start somewhere. And we'd obviously in the West at PacifiCorp been in a very similar dialogue, but as it was touched on, looking for the grand solution and realized that wasn't likely to be in the near future. And when we stepped back and looked at it, we realized we could make a small investment in some infrastructure to get this prototype in place, and very fortunate that California ISO was open to the dialogue, wanting to create this type of situation where we could effectively test it and see what type of benefits would be created. And when you look at it, one, there's absolutely going to be, I strongly believe, economic benefits underlying it. We'll make a small investment, and we see somewhere between $20 to $120 million of benefits. There's a key point to how those benefits are created, and that's how much transmission is available to utilize within those energy imbalance markets. So if it remains fairly limited and people don't free up their, quote, firm transmission rights, even though it may not be being utilized within that 5 minutes, you end up with a much smaller benefit. But if you find a way to utilize those resources across many states, and within that resource, the transmission resource, your benefits are going to go up exponentially. So you've got to solve both of those. So there's no question there's economic benefits. You reap significant environmental benefits because your low-cost resource are going to be your renewables, which means they're getting dispatched and utilized as you wanted to. And as the other panelists touched on, you get significant reliability benefits. So really excited by what's going to progress here. And I think it'll encourage many other folks to evaluate this model. And hopefully we'll see other members or other companies also pursuing it.
So if a company is looking at your model, is looking at the agreement that you have with the Cal ISO, what should they be trying to look for to see whether this is the way to go? I want to enter into an agreement also.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things you're going to look at. One of the drivers on the economic side is what type of reserves do you carry to support your system? And if you're carrying 15 or 20% to balance every 5 minutes, and you can eliminate that or help reduce it at least, and work with another balancing authority, that's going to drive economic benefits immediately. But there will be a big piece, and that's the amount of transmission you have available to participate in the EIM. That will be a challenge that we still have to solve, because how we approach the EIM was saying our firm transmission rights will stay with our customers initially. So how much available transmission do we have that's effectively merchant or available to serve this EIM market? And it's relatively small, and it limits, as I highlighted, our benefits initially. It's never going to stop at that point, because already our team's trying to analyze, well, how do we use our firm transmission rights to now participate in the EIM in a much larger way and help facilitate more benefits both for the California ISO and obviously for our customers at PacifiCorp. So I just see it continually evolving and finding other places where we can create even greater benefits.
So, I mean, we talked about this new grid that we're looking forward to, a flexible grid, okay? But obviously, the system we have now has some flexibility in it that we should try to utilize. In addition to agreements like this, are there other things we can do where we can access the flexibility of that system?
I'll jump in and just say yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important to put all of these changes also in sort of context of a timeline. The EIM is going to be, I think, a really important thing for seeding that regional collaboration that's important for moving bulk energy around. But I think the timeline on that is about 2 years, probably, before it's in effect.
Well, we hope to have it in place in October of 14.
And if you look at all that earlier timeline about incentives and the timing of sort of expiration, we can't wait around 2 years for that to happen. And if we want to take Eric's challenge of pursuing a 51% RPS in California, we do need to look for other sources of flexibility in the grid. And there are many other types of resources. I mean, you can look at changing the capabilities of the existing gas fleets to be able to ramp up, ramp down faster. There's also the huge opportunity that exists in distributed resources. If you look at distributed generation, just the ability to reduce net load and forecast net load, that's huge. I think if you look at demand response, and I think in some of the studies I've seen suggest that you could probably get significant additional capacity for variable generation in a grid with demand response as your first sort of line of attack. So I think it's really, really important to recognize that each one of these pieces together add up to that flexible grid, but you got to move them forward in pieces at the right pace to be able to continue the momentum of change and investment in renewables.
I think it's important to recognize that you do have some flexibility, but you need a lot more flexibility. If you want to get to the high penetration renewables, all our studies suggest is we need a lot more, especially at the distribution level. So and conventional demand response isn't sufficient. What you need is demand response that's advanced to the point where you can shift the peak of the load profile. And if you can do that, then you've got, I think, a real benefit that happens along with the others that you can add to that. In addition, there's a whole bunch of additional what we call smart grid technology improvements that are just now beginning to get introduced at the distribution level. Some of them, like things like smart inverters, for instance, are already at the transmission level, but not at the distribution level. And we need to put essentially the standards in place to allow those to occur that give you the flexibility for two-way power flow, that allow you the flexibility for sensing. I think in the future, if we're going to fully exploit the opportunity of distributed resources of all kinds, you need a lot more analytics, you need a lot more sensing, and you need more control. And then you need to be able to do all the things that are necessary with that. That's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, and to me, it's the research agenda for the next 10 years. I think there's a lot to be done there and a lot of value to go with it.
Yeah, I just would add, I agree with you, Dan, and I think we have to be careful, too, that we support the grid through the right public policies. And the distributed gen does have some value, but if distributed gen means that the person owning the distributed gen is not paying their fair share for the grid, then that means somebody else is, and that ultimately means you're going to starve that very valuable grid of investment. So we do have to be very fact-based, and hopefully that translates to good public policy.
Well, I'm sorry, go on.
One additional item. I think, Greg, you touched on it. We have a system of contractual transmission rights in the West, which is leaving lots of unused transmission capacity on the table. Unlike other regions which are sort of based on the physics of the flows on the path, we have sort of fictitious contracts between people that say once you've got that contract, even if there's nothing flowing on the line, nobody else can put something on it. So we've got a big institutional problem to fix to utilize our existing wires better. And I do think at the transmission level, we have some new promising technology. The industry and DOE put $100 million plus into synchrophasers, which is sort of measurements of the grid many times a second. That's opening the door. We haven't gone through the door yet, but that's opening the door to things like real-time path ratings, or transmission path ratings, which presently we don't have. We presently have sort of seasonal ratings. We make a best guess as what a condition's going to be over the next quarter, and we rate a path. If you had this real-time data, you can actually dynamically set that path rating and squeeze more out of the existing wires.
Well, one of the things, I probably should have told you this before we got up here, but I tend to be an incrementalist, okay? So I like to move, I'm like a person that likes to look at rivets, and you knock in each rivet, and this is the way you move yourself along the wing of that plane. So in order to get this thing to fly, give me the next incremental step each of you, and I'll start at the end and move things. The next step that you think needs to be done, concrete, a rivet, okay? Something we can knock in and get it done. Go ahead.
I think I go back to what I just was touching on. I think we're putting the first rivet in it by executing the agreement with CalISO to create the model that we can all study and evaluate. So it's really taking that first step, getting the EIM in place between PacifiCorp, CalISO, and truly functioning. So I see that as an important first rivet.
Yeah, I would say that there's probably the next, it's chicken and egg to me, which I think is you can either take a point of view that we need to move forward putting the flexible grid in place so that we can expand RPS and not worry about things like backlash or rate bombs or that kind of thing. Or you can look at sort of the RPS as forcing function that basically creates the urgency to be able to make these things happen. So I'll go with the more controversial nail the hammer in here, which is say, I think expand RPS and let that drive the urgency that pushes regulators and agencies to work on solving these problems.
Energy and balance market.
That was quick. Wow. I think many of us have invested in what we call smart grid or smart meter technology, and understanding how best to utilize that technology in front of the meter to better have power flows, better have understanding of how the system works. There will be benefits not just for the utilization of the transmission system, but also improving the way we serve our customers. So, I think all of these things are incremental. I have to disagree, though, with Arno. I don't think that I've been in this business, and Greg and I have been in the renewable business for more than 20 years. I don't think that if we continue to say the way to create a market is to have a state say this is what the percentage should be, will only create markets that don't function properly. If you have 51% in California, that means that Nevada might go to 40% or some other number, and then you have states that don't have numbers like Iowa, but they still wind up developing renewable resources because it's right for the customer. I think ultimately what has to happen here is that all subsidies have to go away, and the technologies have to stand on their own and compete against whatever other technology there is. But I don't think that continue to ramp up RPS is going to do anything but be more disruptive to the market.
I guess I would put a premium on transparency. I think there needs to be a lot more cooperation among various groups, utilities, RTOs, the ISOs, all of the stakeholders that have a stake in how the market develops. One of the things that I find this is an immensely complex issue, and as a consequence, people who tend to not understand the motivations of their partners or potential partners tend to resist any kind of movement. For fear of losing some advantage in the future. I think there needs to be cooperation to the degree that you can begin to forge a mutually beneficial step forward. And I think much of what we have now is driven by fear and intimidation as opposed to more of the market conditions that allow me to flourish and to progress. And so I think we need to change that mindset from one to the other. That relates to having partnerships that have business positive benefits to them by taking some chances, the risk-reward thing. And I think we can do a lot if we just work a little bit closer together in trying to advance what we think is maybe the next step in the future.
I think given the challenges in the West, and the West doesn't have the same homogeneous generation mix that some of these other markets did. So you have people talking off of different books. You've got, the West has a number of electric utilities that aren't investor-owned utilities, and so that complicates it. So I agree with Greg. If we can get that energy and balance market up by October 14th, I think that'd be a major first step, albeit just a first step.
Well, I think I have time for maybe one more question to you guys. There's lots of things that affect markets, right? Lots of outside forces. And one of the outside forces that we've been talking about all today is climate, okay? So Do you guys read Business Week? Business Week had this great little chart for people like me to understand climate. And the chart was divided into two. And the first charts showed all these little dots of where these natural gas processors were. And then it showed the hurricane path sweeping through these places. And then the second chart showed disturbances to the electricity grid based on climate, weather disturbances. And it looked like your heart rate when you're running on that treadmill, dun, 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 up and up and up and up. So climate is also a market force, I think, here, right? That may affect the reliability of the grid. Do you think that adding in a more diversified sources, adding in more renewable energy, adding in different things is going to help you in terms of the stability and reliability of that grid? Because you also have to deal with climate these days.
Yeah,
Ben, start
I
it.
just
Go
say,
ahead.
I think climate is front and center because we rely on electricity more than ever. And so the tolerance not to have it has never been greater. I mean, we demand it, and we won't put up with outages that I think we might have put up with 30, 40 years ago. So I think we have to, and I do think, we talk about distributed resources, gas is a distributed resource today. And so I think there's a lot of value in having these wonderful shale resources scattered across the country that we can take advantage of. So I think we need to focus more on advancing. It's always going to be good to have not all your eggs in one basket. We learned that in first grade, hopefully. And so
That might be why I understood those charts, the Business Week charts.
Not much you need to know past that. So I think that's probably always a good thing.
I'd offer just one sentence that will probably warm the heart of a treasurer, which is just that a diverse portfolio is much more robust in the face of risk.
I would add that there are many challenges besides climate, one of which is cybersecurity and a variety of other things. I think we've got a vulnerability that we haven't fully recognized, and where climate is certainly one of those vulnerabilities. I think resilience of our infrastructure, and specifically the grid, is an important attribute that we need to demand of our future grid. And as a consequence, I think it does scream for things like diversity and diversification, those things that really relate to resilience as well as reliability.
I think Ben's point about the dependence on electricity is extremely important, whether you're talking about climate or just talking about reliability in general. I think there are many things that we can offer to improve the reliability, keep the prices down, and assure that the climate issues are dealt with. I think the argument about climate change is really over. It doesn't really matter at the stage to whether or not the science is perfect or not perfect. We've been experiencing, and Greg and I were talking about this morning, we've been experiencing climate change for billions of years, whether it be the ice age or warming, what have you. Whatever is happening now, we need to address, and I think it's a natural evolution of this industry to produce power as cleanly as possible, while at the same time assuring that the lights are always on, because people have become used to 99.999% reliability. Why? Now they have their iPads and their iPhones and everything that you count on electricity to provide, which we sort of forget about because our reliability is so good. So everything has to be balanced, but I see no reason why the march toward assuring that climate change is dealt with can't be also met with reasonable costs for our customers and continued reliability.
I think there's one sleeper that we have not addressed in the electric sector, and that is methane emissions from production of natural gas and transportation of natural gas. We've typically focused on the fact that methane, when it's burnt, natural gas, when it's burned in a power plant, has only half the emissions of coal. But there's an open research question as to whether the leakage of methane throughout the system is actually making natural gas as damaging to the environment as coal combustion. And I think that's one research issue we need to address soon, because we are building a system that assumes that natural gas has half the carbon emissions of coal.
Well, thank you. It went by very fast. Did you notice that, or was it just me because I was asking questions and you guys got to answer? But anyway, I want to thank you very, very much for being part of this panel, and I want to thank you so much for listening to us today. Thank you very much.